God's Psychiatry, Healing for Your Troubled Heart, written by Dr. Charles Livingston Allen. Part 2. God's Rules for Living. The 10 Commandments. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Exodus 20, 1-17. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Shortly after Moses led the children of Israel away from the bondage of Egypt on their journey to the Promised Land, God called Moses up on Mount Sinai. He must have said something like this: Moses, your people are now headed toward prosperity. The land I've promised to them is rich and productive, and will supply not only their needs, but much more. In fact, the land flows with milk and honey. But Moses, people cannot be made happy and successful merely by the possession of things. The way they live is more important than what they have. So, I'm going to give you 10 rules for living. I want you to teach the people these rules. If they live by them, I promise they will be blessed. But I warn you, if they break these rules, they will be severely penalized. And one other thing, Moses. These are to be the rules of living for all peoples of all times. They will never go out of date. They will never be repealed or changed. We have those rules, known as the 10 Commandments, recorded in Exodus 20. They're not only the basis of conduct, both moral and spiritual, but also the basis of peace and prosperity for the individual and for the world. The Bible says, The fool hath said in his heart, There is no God. Psalm 14:1. And it is only a fool who thinks he is big enough or smart enough to violate the unchangeable laws of the eternal God and get by with it. No man can break God's law. He breaks only himself. Very important is the order in which God stated his laws. The first 4 deal with man's relationship with God, the last 6 with man's relationship with man. Before man can live rightly with each other, he must first get right with God. Someone has said, the golden rule is my religion. But the golden rule is nobody's religion because it's not a religion. It's merely the expression of religion. As H.G. Wells put it, until a man has found God, he begins at no beginning. He works to no end. The first commandment is somewhat surprising. we would think that it would be, "Thou shalt believe in a God," a law against atheism. There is no such law. God took care of that in our creation. We do not teach a baby to hunger or to thirst. Nature does that. However, we must train our children to satisfy their hungers and thirsts with the right things. Man instinctively believes and worships. Nowhere does the Bible attempt to prove the existence of God. Man is created incomplete, and he cannot be at rest until there is a satisfaction of his deepest hunger, the yearning of his soul. The danger lies in that fact that man can pervert his worship instinct and make for himself a false God. St. Augustine said, "My soul is restless until it finds it can rest in Thee, O God." No false god satisfies the longing of the soul, but we can, and many do, squander their lives, seeking satisfaction from false objects of worship. So the first of God's rules for life is, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." At Vicksburg, Mississippi, an engineer showed me an almost dry channel. He explained that once the great Mississippi River flowed there, but now it had been changed into another channel, which had been dug. The flow of the river could not be stopped, but it could be diverted. So with our worship of God. Man is incomplete without an object of worship. The yearning of his soul demands attention, but man can turn from the one true God and make for himself another God. There have been people who worship the sun, or a star, or a mountain. In some countries, people worship a cow, or a river, or something else. We think of those people as being primitive. They are, but no more primitive than multitudes of people in this enlightened land we call America. God said, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," and that law of life we're guilty of breaking. There are 5 objects of worship which multitudes today have put before God: wealth, fame, pleasure, power, and knowledge. While most of us have no idea of ever being really rich, we never become satisfied with what we can reasonably possess. Maybe that is good, except when that dissatisfaction obscures our feelings for God and diverts us in our search for God. I can become so interested in what I have that I forget the needs of my soul. Most of us never expect to be famous, yet the little child says, "See how high I can jump," or "Watch me run." We're born with the desire to be noticed. That's not wrong. God made us separate identities, and we do want to be known. Yet, as a minister, I counsel with many people who have wrecked their lives and destroyed their happiness simply because they have not received the attention they desired. Many get their feelings hurt at the smallest slight. We spend in America more money on cosmetics, for example, than we spend on the entire program of the Kingdom of God. It isn't wrong to want to look our best, but it is wrong when putting ourselves forward becomes our first desire, thus our God. All men want to be happy, but we make a mistake when we think pleasure is the way to get happiness. There is forgetfulness of life's routines in pleasures, but they do not satisfy the soul. Pleasure is like dope. Gradually, we must increase the dose with more excitement, more thrill, more sensation, until, eventually, we find ourselves groping among the tombstones of our dead passions. It's like making our meals out of pickles and pepper. One of our greatest temptations is to put pleasure before God. Power is not wrong, neither is knowledge. The electric power in America is the equal of 150 slaves for each of us, and is a great blessing to us. But power worshipped turns us into little Hitlers. Knowledge is good, but the worship of knowledge destroys obedience, just as the worship of power destroys character. To worship God leads us to be like God, and to obey His will. Thus we become good, and walk in the paths of right living when we have no other gods before God. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. The second rule of God is, Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. This is one rule that most people feel less guilty of breaking, yet more is said about this one in the Bible than any other. Primitive man found it hard to realize a God he could not see, so he made aids to assist his imagination, to bring reality into his worship. That's not wrong. Frank Borum tells of a man who prayed with a vacant chair before him. He imagined God sitting in that chair, and it made his prayers more real. On my desk are several copies of the Bible. I use them in my studying and devotional reading, yet they would be of value to me even if I never opened them. Their very presence serves to remind me of God. Of course, one can worship anywhere, but worship is easier in the church building. Not only the building, but the ritual, the music, and the sermon also are aids to worship. The danger lies in the fact that it's so easy to worship the means instead of the goal. The Bible, churches, music, and ministers, and all our symbols and aids to worship are sacred only because they lead us to God. For example, denominationalism can be a violation of this rule. I am a Methodist, but I could be just as good a Christian as a Baptist, or as a Presbyterian, or in any denomination which says with Peter, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Matthew 16:16. Even more dangerous than our aids to worship are some other images we make. We're told that God created man in his own image, Genesis 1:27. But to live a life in conformity with our creation is difficult. In fact, it's so difficult that all of us fall far, far short. Thus, instead of being like God, we seek to create Him in our own image. It's so much easier to make God like ourselves than for us to be like Him. God tells us not to do wrong, but there are some things we want to do, right or wrong. So we create a God who doesn't care what we do. We think of the God of the blue skies, majestic mountains, and lovely flowers, but turn our backs on the God who said, "Ye have robbed me in tithes and offerings," Malachi 3:8, or the God who said, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap," Galatians 6:7. It's been well pointed out that Christ was not crucified because He said, "Consider the lilies, how they grow," but rather because He said, "Consider the thieves, how they steal." It's so much easier to whittle God down to our size instead of repenting, changing our way of living, and being godly ourselves. When Horace Bushnell was a college student, he felt he was an atheist. One day a voice seemed to say to him, "If you do not believe in God, what do you believe?" He answered back, "I believe there is a difference between right and wrong." "Are you living up to the highest you believe?" the voice seemed to ask. "No," he said, "but I will." That day he dedicated his life to his highest belief. Years later, after he had been pastor of one church 47 years, he said, "Better than I know any person in my church, I know Jesus Christ." When he began conforming his life to his beliefs, instead of making his beliefs fit his life, he was led to a realization of God. The very process of thinking requires mental pictures or images. Think of an apple, and you see one in your imagination. Think of Abraham Lincoln, and his face is flashed on the screen of your mind. And when one thinks of God, he sees some picture of God. The danger lies in the fact that it can be the wrong picture, which can be tragic. One becomes like his image of God, and if it's the wrong image, the man becomes wrong. So the Bible contains more warning in regard to God's second rule for life. "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," Exodus 20:4, than in regard to any of the other 10. Man sees a little of God in many forms: majesty in His mountains, greatness in His seas, loveliness in His flowers, righteousness in His saints. But all of these are insufficient. With Philip, the heart of each of us says, "Lord, show us the Father." Jesus replied, "He that hath seen me hath seen the Father." John 14:8 and 9. The only perfect image of God we have is Christ, and that is sufficient. As you see Him through the words of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you're impressed with His eyes. Those who were with Him in the flesh neglected to tell us much about His physical appearance. but they could not forget his eyes. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, Luke 22:61, and Peter broke down. Sometimes Jesus' eyes flashed with merriment, sometimes